In the gaslit streets of Victorian London, another world flourished in the shadows, a world the respectable classes pretended not to see. Behind the grandeur of empire and industrial progress lay a brutal underworld of poverty, desperation, and survival. Here, thousands of women, some barely into their teens, were forced into sex work by circumstance, coercion, or sheer hunger. They were judged, condemned, and used. Yet their stories reveal the hidden heart of Victorian society, its hypocrisies, its moral panics, its obsession with purity, and its failure to protect the most vulnerable. This is not the story of empire's glory, but of those left in its shadows, the women whose lives tell us more about the true face of the Victorian age than its monuments ever could. Victorian Britain, stretching from 1837 to 1901 under the reign of Queen Victoria, was an era defined by contradictions so stark that contemporaries themselves remarked on the gulf. On the one hand, Britain was the most powerful empire in the world, its navy dominating seas, its industries driving the global economy, and its cities filled with grand architecture, glittering exhibitions, and an elite who prided themselves on morality, discipline, and progress. Yet beneath the polished veneer of middle-class respectability, another Britain thrived in the shadows, one of slums, disease, child labor, and prostitution on a scale unmatched in the country's history. The very same empire that boasted of its civilization and Christian virtue was sustained by poverty, exploitation, and hypocrisy. By mid-century, Britain was at the heart of the Industrial Revolution. London, Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham had grown into urban giants. Factories thundered with machinery powered by coal and steam, and fortunes were made in shipping, finance, textiles, and trade. In 1851, the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park presented Britain to the world as a pinnacle of industry and progress. More than 6 million visitors marveled at technological wonders beneath Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace, from steam engines to precision instruments, all framed as evidence of society marching confidently toward modernity. To the upper and middle classes, this was a celebration of British genius and moral superiority. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert cast the empire as a beacon of progress, where hard work, sobriety, and Christian values shaped society. But the same period that produced the Crystal Palace also produced overcrowded tenements where sewage ran in the streets, where entire families lived in a single damp room, and where child mortality rates in industrial cities often exceeded 30% before the age of 5. Friedrich Engels, observing Manchester in the 1840s, described living conditions as disgusting, with back-to-back housing, open drains, and disease spreading rapidly. For the middle and upper classes, industrial growth was evidence of providence. For the poor, it was a sentence of grinding labor and short lives. The contrast was nowhere sharper than in London, where Mayfair's mansions existed only streets away from the East End's rookeries. Slums so notorious that Charles Dickens and Henry Mayhew documented their horrors in detail. Victorian morality was central to this divide. Publicly, the age was marked by a relentless emphasis on respectability. Middle-class families adhered to strict codes of behavior, with men expected to embody discipline in industry, and women framed as guardians of purity and domestic virtue. Religion reinforced these expectations. Evangelicalism swept through the 19th century, promoting sobriety, chastity, and social reform, but also fueling judgment and condemnation of those who did not conform. The fallen woman became one of the era's defining moral symbols, the prostitute who had lost her virtue and therefore, in the eyes of polite society, her humanity. Public campaigns railed against immorality in streets and theaters, while legislation such as the Obscene Publications Act of 1857 sought to regulate what people could read or view. Yet behind closed doors, the reality was starkly different. London alone was estimated to have between 50,000 and 80,000 prostitutes during the mid-19th century, according to contemporary investigations. Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor describe entire districts where brothels operated openly and child prostitution was a grim reality. While the middle classes thundered about morality, demand for sex work came overwhelmingly from respectable men, clerks, tradesmen, politicians, and even clergy. This double standard defined the Victorian sexual economy. Publicly, women were expected to embody chastity. Privately, they were exploited to satisfy desires that society refused to acknowledge. The hypocrisy was institutional as well as personal. The British state itself codified the double standard in laws such as the Contagious Diseases Act of the 1860s, which subjected suspected prostitutes in garrison towns to invasive medical examinations for venereal disease. No such controls applied to the men who used them. Reformers like Josephine Butler condemned the act as an assault on women's dignity, exposing how deeply institutionalized gender inequality was in Victorian society. At the same time, newspapers sensationalized scandals involving white slavery and underage prostitution, stoking moral panic while selling copies to eager readers. This pattern of contradiction was not confined to sex. It extended into every sphere of Victorian life. While the elite extolled the virtues of sobriety, gin palaces thrived in working-class districts. While the empire celebrated liberty, it profited from colonies maintained through coercion and, in earlier decades, from the legacy of slavery. While literature praised domestic virtue, novels and penny dreadfuls sold stories of crime, seduction, and vice in enormous numbers. Dickens himself exemplified the paradox, condemning immorality in his works while vividly describing the underworld that fascinated his readers. The economic structures of Victorian Britain deepened this split. Industrial progress created enormous wealth for factory owners, merchants, and financiers, while workers endured long hours, dangerous conditions, and pitiful wages. For many women, opportunities were even narrower. With limited legal rights, exclusion from most professions, and widespread prejudice, countless working-class women turned to prostitution as survival. This was not a matter of choice but of necessity, and contemporary reformers knew it. William Acton, the physician who studied prostitution in London, famously remarked in 1857 that prostitution is a necessary evil of society. To middle-class men, the trade was framed as inevitable, even natural. To the women trapped in it, it was exploitation made invisible by moral posturing. Urban spaces embodied this duality. By day, central London was the heart of empire, Westminster with its new Parliament buildings, Fleet Street with its newspapers, the Bank of England as a symbol of global finance. By night, the same city revealed its shadows, Haymarket filled with streetwalkers, Covent Garden's backstreets with brothels, and the East End's labyrinthine alleys where poverty bred crime and desperation. Police reform under Sir Robert Peel had created the Metropolitan Police in 1829, but law enforcement often turned a blind eye to prostitution while cracking down harshly on petty theft or disorder. Respectability was less about justice than about appearances. The contradictions were not lost on contemporaries. Social commentators like Engels, Dickens, Mayhew, and reformers such as Florence Nightingale or Josephine Butler continually highlighted the chasm between wealth and misery, morality and hypocrisy. Their writings reveal how deeply society struggled with its own image. The Victorian self-image of moral progress and imperial destiny was constantly undermined by the realities of urban poverty and vice. The two nations, the rich and the poor, described by Benjamin Disraeli in his 1845 novel Sybil, were not merely literary invention, but a lived reality in every city of Britain. In the end, the two faces of Victorian Britain were inseparable. The wealth of the empire depended on labor extracted from the poor. The moral strictures of society were maintained by ignoring the exploitation on which they rested. The grandeur of the Crystal Palace and the slums of Whitechapel were two sides of the same coin. The very insistence on morality intensified the stigma against those who could not meet its demands, leaving thousands of women condemned for doing what survival demanded. The story of Victorian Britain is not the triumph of respectability over vice, but the coexistence of both side by side, each defining the other. The story of prostitution in Victorian Britain cannot be understood without first confronting the trap of poverty that ensnared millions. For sex work in the 19th century was rarely a matter of free choice or deliberate rebellion against society's codes, but overwhelmingly an act of survival forced upon women by circumstances of class, economy, and family breakdown. And when industrialization reshaped Britain's economy, it created both immense wealth and immense precarity, drawing rural migrants into cities that could not absorb them, producing slums where survival itself became a daily struggle. And into these spaces women were thrust, left with few legal rights, almost no access to education or skilled employment, and burdened by the constant risk of abandonment, widowhood, or unemployment, any one of which could push them into the sex trade. By 1851, the census revealed that Britain's population had swelled to more than 21 million, with London alone home to over 2.3 million people, making it the largest city in the world. And this growth was fueled by rural families leaving villages in search of wages in factories, mills, and workshops. But the reality they encountered was overcrowding, unemployment, and relentless competition for low-paid work. And in this environment, women were disproportionately vulnerable, for factory jobs were limited, domestic service positions were grueling and insecure, and many trades barred women entirely, leaving them dependent on men or on the most poorly paid forms of labor. The 1850s and 1860s saw wages for unskilled women stagnate at levels so low they could barely afford bread, and reports from the period reveal that laundresses, seamstresses, and match girls often earned less than a shilling a day, while rent for a single squalid room might consume half of that, leaving hunger as a constant companion of poverty. The economic trap was worsened by demographics. High mortality rates among men left thousands of widows unsupported, while illegitimacy, though common, carried such heavy stigma that women with children out of wedlock found themselves almost unemployable, and so the descent into prostitution was less a fall from virtue than a push from circumstance. Henry Mayhew, in his monumental survey London Labour and the London Poor, 1851, recorded testimony from working women who admitted that starvation, debt, or the eviction of a sick parent drove them to the streets, and his interviews paint a stark picture of prostitution as a last desperate recourse when all other avenues closed. He wrote of women who had once been servants but, dismissed without references, could no longer secure work, of daughters who had sold themselves after their fathers died in accidents, of wives abandoned by husbands who emigrated or disappeared, and of children who, barely teenagers, turned to the trade to keep siblings fed. This cycle reveals how poverty in Victorian Britain was not merely individual misfortune, but a systemic trap produced by economic structures that enriched the few at the expense of the many. Urbanization intensified this reality. Cities like London, Manchester, and Liverpool grew so rapidly that infrastructure could not keep pace, and slums became breeding ground for disease and crime, with cholera epidemics in 1832, 1848, and 1854 killing tens of thousands, and yet landlords continued to profit by cramming entire families into damp, airless rooms, charging extortionate rents for accommodation barely fit for habitation. Charles Booth's famous poverty maps, produced later in the 1880s and 1890s, still revealed entire districts of London where chronic want and semi-criminal classes predominated. But even earlier accounts show the scale of desperation in the mid-century. In such neighborhoods, prostitution was both visible and normalized, for brothels and lodging houses often operated side by side with honest families, and the blurred boundaries of poverty meant that many children grew up surrounded by the trade. The trap was reinforced by law. Women had few legal protections, and the poor law system of workhouses, designed as a deterrent against dependency, was so harsh that many preferred prostitution to the indignity of confinement within them. The new Poor Law of 1834 had established a principle that relief would only be given within workhouses, where families were separated, food was meager, and labor was degrading, effectively criminalizing poverty itself. And so women face a choice between starvation, the workhouse, or the street. In this way, prostitution became not simply a moral failing in the eyes of society, but an inevitable outcome of policies that punished the poor for being poor. The vulnerability of women was also tied to the ideology of domesticity, which defined them as dependents of men, guardians of virtue, and unsuited to public life. But when men failed to provide, through death, unemployment, or abandonment, women were left without support, their social role collapsing beneath them. Widows, in particular, appeared disproportionately in contemporary records of prostitutes, showing how fragile the domestic ideal was when confronted with economic reality. Even marriage was no guarantee of stability, for husbands could and did desert families without legal consequence until the late 19th century, and wives left behind were condemned to disgrace if they turned to prostitution. The economic trap was thus both structural and cultural. Women were denied opportunities to earn, denied respect if they fell, and denied compassion by a society that prided itself on morality. The evidence is overwhelming. In 1864, William Acton estimated that London alone contained between 80,000 and 100,000 prostitutes, and his studies, though controversial, revealed that the majority came from backgrounds of poverty rather than moral corruption. Reports of Parliament confirmed the link between economic deprivation and sex work, noting that periods of economic downturn always coincided with rises in prostitution arrests. The trap extended across age groups. Girls as young as 12 or 13 were documented in police reports as working the streets, often having been abandoned or sold by destitute families, while older women, widows in their 40s or 50s, sometimes entered prostitution after losing employment as laundresses or charwomen. The Victorian press sensationalized child prostitution, with William Stead's 1885 expose, the maiden tribute of modern Babylon, shocking the public with accounts of underage exploitation. But long before the scandal, the reality had been known and ignored by elites who saw poverty not as a systemic failure but as a moral weakness of individuals. And so the urban trap was complete. Cities that promised opportunity instead delivered destitution. Economic systems that celebrated wealth produced desperation. Moral codes that preached virtue condemned the desperate, and laws that claimed to uphold order instead punished survival. In this context, prostitution was not a hidden vice but a visible feature of urban poverty, woven into the very fabric of Victorian society. When one looks at the figures, the testimonies, and the slums themselves, it becomes clear that the majority of women in the sex trade were not fallen, but pushed, trapped by structures beyond their control, and their plight reveals a harsh truth of Victorian Britain, that its prosperity was built upon inequality so stark that for countless women, the only choice was between the street, the workhouse, or the grave. In Victorian Britain, no figure symbolized a contradiction between morality and reality more powerfully than the so-called fallen woman, and no archetype shaped the public understanding of prostitution more than Mary Magdalene, whose biblical transformation from sinner to penitent became the lens through which society framed the women who sold sex. For in an age obsessed with virtue, purity, and redemption, prostitutes were cast not as individuals with complex lives, but as moral symbols, embodiments of failure or salvation, vice or repentance, depending on how society chose to look at them. And this culture of moral interpretation came to be known as the Age of the Magdalene, a period in which countless institutions, campaigns, sermons, and works of literature revolved around the effort to define, condemn, or redeem women who strayed from a Victorian ideal of chastity. The metaphor of the Magdalene was powerful precisely because it blended religion with social control, offering both condemnation and the possibility of redemption. And under its shadow, prostitution was framed not as an economic trap, as reformers like Mayhew quietly documented, but as a spiritual fall, a moral catastrophe that required punishment, penitence, or salvation. This narrative dominated the mid-19th century. Charitable institutions such as the Magdalen Asylums proliferated across Britain, beginning in the late 18th century but expanding rapidly in the Victorian period, designed to house and reform prostitutes through regimes of prayer, discipline, and manual labor. The London Magdalen Hospital, founded in 1758, was a prototype, but by the 1840s and 1850s, similar institutions dotted the country, often run by evangelical reformers who believed that fallen women could be rescued through religious devotion and strict obedience. Life in these asylums was harsh. Women who entered were often required to renounce their past, adopt plain clothing, submit to rigid schedules of work and prayer, and cut ties with former associates. Some genuinely sought refuge, especially those escaping violent pimps or desperate poverty, but many were coerced by families, police, or reformers into institutions where their voices were silenced and their agency erased. The Magdalene model reflected a broader Victorian obsession with controlling female sexuality. Respectable women were defined by purity, and so those who transgressed were cast as outcasts, morally contagious, threatening the social order. Sermons thundered about the dangers of immorality, novels and newspapers dramatized the plight of the fallen, and campaigns arose not only to suppress prostitution, but to define the prostitute as a cautionary tale. Josephine Butler, one of the few reformers who spoke out for women's rights, noted bitterly that society defined prostitutes as both essential and damned, tolerated because men demanded them, condemned because women were expected to be virtuous. This paradox lay at the heart of the Magdalene narrative. Women were blamed for a system that was structured against them. Literature amplified this narrative. Writers such as Dickens, while sympathetic to the poor, still relied on the trope of the fallen woman in characters like Nancy and Oliver Twist, whose path to redemption could only end in death. Thomas Hardy's Tess, written later in the century, was destroyed by a perceived impurity, showing how the Magdalene archetype persisted into late Victorian literature. These cultural representations reinforce the idea that once a woman fell, her life was irredeemably altered, and her only choices were penitence, institutionalization, or death. Even the medical profession adopted this framework. Physicians such as William Acton wrote extensively about prostitution, framing it as both a necessary outlet for male desire and a threat to public health, but always couched in language that cast women as a source of danger. Acton's famous assertion that the majority of women are not much trouble with sexual feeling of any kind encapsulated the Victorian belief that female sexuality outside of marriage was pathological, and prostitutes were the ultimate embodiment of that pathology. Thus, the Magdalene archetype became a scientific as well as moral construct, shaping policies such as the Contagious Diseases Act, which targeted prostitutes for invasive examinations under the guise of controlling venereal disease. Religion, science, and law converged to frame sex workers as moral deviants who needed control, redemption, or eradication. Yet beneath this powerful cultural narrative, cracks began to appear. Reformers like Butler led the Ladies' National Association in the 1860s and 1870s to campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts, arguing that they violated women's dignity and embodied the hypocrisy of punishing women while ignoring men. Their activism revealed that the Magdalene framework was not uncontested. Prostitutes themselves, though rarely given a voice in print, sometimes resisted by fleeing asylums, rejecting reform, or continuing their trade openly in defiance of condemnation. But the weight of the Magdalene archetype remained crushing. Women who entered prostitution were rarely allowed to re-enter respectability, even if they left the trade. Respectable employment required character references and reputation, both of which were destroyed by exposure to the sex trade. Thus, the language of redemption was often hollow, for society offered little in the way of genuine reintegration. Instead, the Magdalene narrative functioned as a cultural tool to reinforce the boundaries of gender and class, reminding respectable women of the cost of transgression and condemning the poor to bear the burden of moral panic. The paradox of the age of the Magdalene is that it tells us less about prostitutes themselves and more about Victorian society's obsession with purity, reputation, and control. Prostitutes became screens onto which society projected its anxieties about sexuality, poverty, disease, and order. Their lives, their choices, Their suffering were often erased beneath the archetype of the fallen woman. And so when we look back at the Magdalene institutions, the sermons, the novels, and the laws, we see not only the story of sex work, but the story of how society defined itself by condemning those who lived in its shadows. The Magdalene archetype remains one of the most revealing symbols of Victorian hypocrisy, a culture that claimed compassion while practicing control, that preached redemption while denying reintegration, that built institutions to save women while ensuring that poverty and inequality kept them in need of saving. By the middle decades of the 19th century, the streets of Britain's growing cities had become both engines of progress and theatres of vice, and nowhere was this more visible than in London, Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham, where industrial expansion brought with an underworld of brothels, streetwalkers, and clandestine rooms that contemporaries describe with fascination, horror, and, at times, a morbid kind of curiosity. For the Victorians lived in a world where public morality condemned prostitution as a sin, yet its presence was so widespread and visible that few could ignore it. London, the beating heart of empire, was estimated to have between 50,000 and 80,000 prostitutes at mid-century, and the city's geography reflected this hidden economy. Districts such as Covent Garden, St. Giles, Holborn, and the Haymarket were notorious for their concentration of brothels, music halls, and houses of accommodation, where women rented rooms by the hour. The East End, especially Whitechapel and Shoreditch, provided lodging houses where sex work mingled with petty crime, while the West End saw more organized establishments catering to middle and upper-class men. Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor offers some of the richest detail, describing streetwalkers who plied their trade along the Strand, Regent Street, and Leicester Square, often standing under gas lamps to display themselves to potential clients. Their clothing varied by class. Poorer women dressed in shabby finery, often second-hand silks or brightly colored shawls meant to catch attention, while higher-class courtesans wore elegant gowns and jewels, distinguishing themselves from the masses of desperate streetwalkers. Police reports and court record provide further glimpses of this world. The Metropolitan Police, founded in 1829, kept careful watch over areas known for prostitution, yet enforcement was inconsistent and often corrupt. Brothel keepers frequently bribed constables to turn a blind eye, and reformers complained that the law punished individual women far more harshly than the men who profited from or patronized them. Prosecutions under vagrancy laws often led to short imprisonments for women accused of soliciting, but rarely touched the wealthier clients whose demands sustained the trade. In Manchester and Liverpool, the situation was similar. Industrial wealth poured into the cities, drawing tens of thousands of male laborers, sailors, and factory workers, many of them unmarried and living in boarding houses. In such environments, demand for prostitution was high, and local authorities often tolerated it as a safety valve for male desire. Brothels in port cities thrived on sailors with money to spend, and reformers noted that entire streets in Liverpool's docklands were given over to prostitution. In Manchester, the grim industrial slums provided cover for sex work conducted in cellar rooms, attics, and cheap lodging houses. Brothel district acquired reputation so strong that their very names became synonymous with vice. The Haymarket in London was famous not only for its theatres and music halls, but for the throngs of prostitutes who mingled with men after performances. Cider Cellars, a popular tavern, was known as much for its sexual encounters as for its entertainment. Reformers such as William Tate and James Beard described in their studies how brothels ranged from luxurious establishments catering to gentlemen with private dining rooms and expensive wines, to squalid, disease-ridden rooms where women barely earned enough to survive. The visibility of prostitution made it a constant subject of fascination in newspapers and penny literature. Journalists reported sensational accounts of vice districts, sometimes exaggerating numbers for effect, while reformers published lurid descriptions intended to stir outrage. Yet this very publicity also ensured that prostitution was normalized in the public imagination, part of the urban landscape as familiar as horse-drawn carriages or street markets. The sheer scale of the trade was reinforced by demographic realities. Britain's cities contained large populations of single men, soldiers, sailors, labourers, and clerks, whose presence created a steady demand. At the same time, women outnumbered men in many urban centres, a demographic imbalance noted in census data, leaving thousands of women without the prospect of marriage and forcing them to seek income in whatever way they could. In such a society, the street became both workplace and trap, with women competing against each other in districts where poverty and exploitation ruled. The risks were immense. Disease was rampant. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other infections spread rapidly, and without effective treatment until the late 19th century, they often left women disfigured, infertile, or dead. Violence was another constant danger. Prostitutes were vulnerable to assault by clients, pimps, and gangs, with little recourse to law. Police often treated their complaints with indifference, seeing them as criminals rather than victims. The murders of women in Whitechapel in the 1880s, later attributed to Jack the Ripper, were only the most sensational examples of violence that had long plagued the trade. Yet in spite of these dangers, prostitution was deeply embedded in urban economies. Landlords profited from brothels, gin sellers from late-night drinkers, and tailors from the demand for flashy clothing. Some women, especially courtesans and mistresses supported by wealthy men, achieved relative prosperity, living in fine apartments and enjoying a level of independence rare for women of the time. Figures like Catherine Walters, known as Skittles, became celebrities of a sort, their lives reported in the press with fascination. But for the vast majority, sex work was precarious, low-paid, and degrading, carried out in filthy rooms or on rain-soaked pavements. The language of the period reflected society's conflicted attitudes. Prostitutes were described as streetwalkers, fallen women, unfortunates, or public women, each term carrying moral judgment. Writers like Mayhew or Acton sought to categorize them by class, distinguishing between common prostitutes who worked the streets, kept women supported by single men, and courtesans who mingled with the elite. Yet these distinctions often obscure the underlying reality. All were stigmatized, all were denied respectability, and all were trapped in an economy that commodified women's bodies while condemning them for selling. The streets of sin were therefore not simply districts of vice, but reflections of the structural contradictions of Victorian Britain. They revealed the failures of the poor law, which drove women away from workhouses into prostitution. They exposed the hypocrisy of respectable men who condemned the trade in public while supporting it in private. And they highlighted the precariousness of life for working-class women, whose survival often depended on nightly transactions under gaslight. By the final decades of the century, reform campaigns began to make prostitution less visible, with crackdowns on brothels and sensational press campaigns about white slavery shifting public focus. But in the mid-Victorian period, the streets were saturated with the trade. The brothel districts, the gaslit pavements, the music halls filled with mingling prostitutes and clients, all were integral parts of urban life, tolerated even as they were denounced. In the end, the streets of sin were not aberrations but essential components of Victorian society, feeding its economy, entertaining its men, and reminding its moralists of the contradictions they could neither solve nor escape. Among the most disturbing and least comfortable realities of Victorian Britain was the prevalence of child prostitution, a phenomenon that contemporaries simultaneously ignored, sensationalized, or politicized, but which remains one of the darkest indictments of the 19th century social structures, for behind the polished image of moral Britain, thousands of girls, some not yet in their teens, were forced, coerced, or maneuvered by sheer destitution into the sex trade, their stories, exposing the hollowness of society that claimed to uphold Christian virtue while tolerating the exploitation of its most vulnerable. The evidence appears early in the century, with Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor recording testimony of children who had entered prostitution at ages 12 and 13, often abandoned by families, lured by promises of lodging or food, or pushed by mothers and fathers who themselves lived on the brink of starvation, and Mayhew's accounts were corroborated by police and medical reports showing venereal diseases in children under the age of 15, proof of a reality most preferred not to confront, for the law at the time set the age of consent at only 12, effectively legalizing sexual exploitation until public scandals later forced change, and within this legal vacuum, brothels and lodging houses openly traded in young girls, capitalizing on the belief, widespread among male clients, that younger bodies meant safety from infection, a perverse logic that made children not less vulnerable to demand but more, so that youth itself became a commodity in the sexual economy of empire. London was the epicenter, its labyrinth of lodging houses in Whitechapel, Shoreditch, and Holborn offering cover for what reformers later called a traffic in innocence, but port cities such as Liverpool and Bristol also developed reputations, their docklands attracting sailors and travelers who sustained demand, and in Manchester, investigators documented girls as young as 13 working in cellars or cheap brothels near factories, while in Edinburgh, William Tate's Magdalenism, 1840, condemned the fearful extent of child prostitution in Scotland's capital. For decades, however, such warnings stirred little reform, in part because the Victorian establishment found it easier to frame prostitution as a matter of adult females than confront the exploitation of children, and when the issue did rise to public attention, it often did so through sensationalism, the most famous case being William Thomas Stead's 1885 expose, The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, in the Pall Mall Gazette, in which Stead set out to prove how easily a child could be purchased in London by arranging the sale of 13-year-old Eliza Armstrong, an act that horrified the public, provoked outrage in Parliament, and led directly to the passing of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which raised the age of consent from 13 to 16 and strengthened laws against brothel keeping and trafficking. Yet even this reform revealed the hypocrisies of the system, for Stead himself was later imprisoned for abduction due to his methods, and the plight of thousands of children before Armstrong had been ignored for decades. Medical records, reform tracts, and court transcript from a mid-century show the breadth of the crisis. Dr. Acton noted cases of syphilis in girls not yet in their teens. The Morning chronicles 1858 investigations uncovered lodging houses where children were exploited nightly, and testimonies collected by the Salvation Army described parents who sold daughters for a few shillings, either to pimps or directly to clients. Josephine Butler, the most prominent female reformer of the age, decried this reality in speeches and pamphlets, framing it as both a moral and national disgrace, arguing that an empire which prided itself on civilizing the world was incapable of protecting its own children. And indeed the scandal was often framed in imperial terms, with critics warning that Britain's reputation abroad would suffer if the sexual exploitation of children continued unchecked, but the domestic response remained ambivalent, as parliamentarians decried the abuse while simultaneously resisting structural reforms to alleviate the poverty that created vulnerability in the first place. The demographics tell their own story, for census data reveals that women consistently outnumbered men in urban centers, leaving thousands of young girls without prospects of marriage or support, while the poor law system ensured that entry into a workhouse was a fate many sought to avoid at all costs, pushing children instead into the shadows of the street. Social stigma compounded the problem, for even when children were clearly coerced or trafficked, once marked as prostitutes, they were treated by society and often by the law as fallen, their innocence erased by a single encounter, a cruelty reflected in the language of court reports that labeled 13-year-olds as common women, erasing the possibility of rehabilitation. The issue was not confined to Britain itself, for imperial networks facilitated trafficking, with reports of British girls taken to continental Europe, the colonies, and beyond, feeding anxieties about the so-called white slave trade, a phrase that became a rallying cry for reform but also served political agendas, as fears of foreign vice often overshadowed the domestic roots of the problem. The panic over white slavery in the 1870s and 1880s, though sometimes exaggerated, reflected a kernel of truth. that organized networks of pimps and traffickers did exist, and that children were particularly vulnerable within them. Yet what these campaigns often missed was the more mundane and widespread reality of poverty-driven child prostitution in every major city. The scandal of the Maiden Tribute finally forced action. But the Criminal Law Amendment Act, while significant, did not eliminate the problem, as enforcement remained patchy and corruption among police and magistrates often shielded clients of means, while poor children continued to be arrested for soliciting, treated as criminals rather than victims. And so the story of child prostitution in Victorian Britain is one of exposure and denial, outrage and inertia. Reform achieved only when scandal forced it, and above all, children trapped in a system that commodified their bodies while denying their humanity, a reality that strips away the comforting myths of Victorian morality and reveals the dark underside of the so-called Age of Progress, where empire was celebrated abroad but innocence was betrayed at home, leaving generations of children in the shadows of Britain's streets and in the margins of its history, remembered today as the most haunting victims of society that prided itself on virtue while tolerating vice at its very core. Behind the visible world of Victorian prostitution, behind the streetwalkers under gaslight, the lodging houses of Whitechapel, and the music halls where men mingled with women after dark, stood another layer of actors whose presence reveals the structured, organized, and commercial nature of the sex trade. The brothel keepers and madams who manage the houses, arrange the transactions, and mediated between the women, the clients, and the law, figures who were simultaneously condemned as corrupters of public morals and tolerated as providers of a service that society refused to acknowledge openly but depended upon continually, and the reality of their role forces us to reconsider prostitution not simply as an individual act of desperation, but as part of a wider economy shaped by power, profit, and hypocrisy. London by mid-century contained thousands of brothels ranging from discreet, well-appointed establishments in the West End to sordid, disorderly houses in the East, and estimates from contemporaries like William Acton placed their numbers in the low thousands, though definitions varied depending on whether one counted large organized houses, small lodgings where women worked independently, or private apartments rented for encounters. Regardless of categorization, brothel keeping was a business, and those who ran the houses, whether women or men, operated within a commercial framework of rent, supply, and demand. In wealthier districts such as Mayfair and Bloomsbury, brothels sometimes presented themselves almost as salons, with madams cultivating a select clientele of gentlemen, offering not just sexual services but music, food, and companionship. And these establishments often employed courtesans who could move between roles of sexual partner and social entertainer, blurring the lines between sex work and high society. Famous courtesans who aged out of direct sex work occasionally became madams themselves, leveraging their connections to sustain a profitable business. In contrast, the East End and poorer quarters saw houses of a very different nature, squalid rooms rented by the hour, overcrowded, dirty, and often controlled by unscrupulous keepers who profited from desperation, extracting the majority of women's earnings while offering no protection from disease or violence. Henry Mayhew, in London Labour and the London Poor, interviewed women who described their dependence on landladies who acted as intermediaries, sometimes sympathetic but often exploitative, while police records show that many brothel keepers colluded with pimps or traffickers to control women through debt, threats, or outright imprisonment. Yet not all madams fit the image of ruthless exploiter. Some women, themselves former prostitutes, framed their role as offering shelter and management in an economy that offered little else, providing relative safety compared to street walking, though even in these cases, the balance of power was rarely equal, and dependency made exploitation easy. The law treated brothel keeping with hostility in principle but leniency in practice. Disorderly houses could be prosecuted under the Disorderly Houses Act or the Vagrancy Acts, and moral reform societies often pressed for raids, yet enforcement was selective and inconsistent, with constables frequently bribed to ignore establishments or protect influential clients. Brothel keeping thus thrived in a space between legality and illegality, tolerated so long as it remained discreet and did not provoke scandal. Wealthy establishments in the West End often operated with impunity, while poorer brothels in slum districts faced harsher scrutiny, reflecting once again the class bias that permeated Victorian law enforcement. The Contagious Diseases Acts of the 1860s and 1870s, though primarily aimed at prostitutes, had significant implications for brothel keeping, as they gave police greater authority to register and inspect women, effectively turning brothels into sites of surveillance and control. And reformers like Josephine Butler condemned the system as one that empowered brothel keepers to collaborate with authorities in policing women's bodies. For clients, brothels offered anonymity, choice, and relative safety compared to the streets, while for women, they provided a roof, some degree of order, and sometimes protection from random violence. But these advantages were bought at the cost of control by keepers who managed access to clients, dictated terms, and absorbed much of the income. In port cities such as Liverpool and Bristol, brothel keeping took on a distinctly international character, with houses catering to sailors and travelers, some of which became notorious for trafficking young women from Britain and abroad, fueling both reality and rumor about the white slave trade. Parliamentary investigations in the late 19th century heard testimony about networks of brothel keepers moving women between Britain and the continent, often under false promises of domestic service, a practice that reformers seized upon as evidence of national disgrace. The cultural image of the brothel keeper was shaped by both moral reformers and sensational journalism. Newspapers such as the Illustrated Police News published lurid accounts of raids, portraying madams as sinister figures corrupting youth, while reform pamphlets describe interiors filled with disease and vice. Yet the fascination with brothels also extended to literature and theatre, where depictions oscillated between horror and titillation. To Victorians, the brothel was both a symbol of social decay and a hidden curiosity, a place everyone knew existed but few would admit to knowing directly. The role of madams and keepers thus encapsulates the contradictions of Victorian prostitution. They were vilified as corrupters, yet their existence was sustained by the demand of respectable men. They were prosecuted when convenient, yet tolerated when their houses provided outlets that contained vice within defined spaces. They were condemned as exploiters of women, yet in some cases themselves women who sought survival and even agency within an oppressive system. Their presence reminds us that prostitution in the 19th century was not merely a matter of women and clients, but a structured business, one that implicated landlords, police, and society at large in its perpetuation. The story of brothel keepers and madams therefore reveals more than the mechanics of vice. It exposes the economic, legal, and cultural frameworks that allowed prostitution to flourish in society obsessed with morality yet addicted to hypocrisy, a society that claimed to police virtue while ensuring that those who managed its hidden trades continued to profit in the shadows of empire. One of the most striking contradictions of Victorian Britain lay in the behavior of the very men who set the moral tone of the age, for while politicians, magistrates, writers, and clergymen thundered in Parliament, pulpits, and print about the dangers of immorality, thousands of them privately sustained the very system they condemned, frequenting brothels, employing prostitutes, or keeping mistresses, and it is within this duality, the public image of respectability versus the private pursuit of desire, that we see the full scope of the Victorian gentleman's hypocrisy, a hypocrisy that shaped the lives of women, corrupted the application of law, and revealed the hollowness of claims to moral authority. Respectability in Victorian Britain was both a social ideal and a weapon. For the middle and upper classes, it was essential to be seen as disciplined, virtuous, and above reproach, and public identity was carefully curated through church attendance, charitable giving, and strict family codes. Yet beneath this performance lay a reality of indulgence, double standards, and quiet complicity in the very vices that society declared intolerable. Parliamentary debates about prostitution reveal this contradiction clearly. In the 1860s, when the Contagious Diseases Acts were introduced, members of Parliament spoke about the need to protect soldiers and sailors from disease, framing prostitution as a threat to military efficiency. Nowhere in these debates was male responsibility acknowledged. Women were to be inspected, detained, and controlled, while men, the very men funding and patronizing the trade, were treated as blameless. Josephine Butler and her fellow activists condemned this hypocrisy, pointing out that legislation effectively enshrined a double standard. Men's sexuality was natural and unavoidable. Women's sexuality outside marriage was criminal and pathological. Physicians like William Acton reinforced this view, arguing that prostitution was a necessary evil because men required outlets, a claim that cast prostitutes simultaneously as indispensable and damned. Behind closed doors, the same elite men who railed against immorality in public consumed it in private. Diaries, court cases, and police record provide glimpses of this hidden world. Gentlemen were frequent clients of high-class courtesans, some of whom became celebrities in their own right. Catherine Walters, known as Skittles, was courted by aristocrats and members of Parliament, her notoriety documented in gossip columns and satirical prints. Other courtesans like Harriet Wilson openly published memoirs detailing their affairs with lords, politicians, and even royalty, exposing how deeply prostitution penetrated the highest levels of society. These revelations caused scandal but rarely destroyed the reputations of men involved. Women were shamed, ostracized, or silenced, while men often continued their careers unaffected. The hypocrisy extended beyond private indulgence to active complicity in the system. Landlords of brothels were often gentlemen investing discreetly for profit, while magistrates and police were known to accept bribes to protect establishments serving wealthier clients. In London's West End, brothels catering to upper-class men operated with near impunity, while poor women in the East End were routinely arrested for soliciting. This class-based application of morality reinforced the divide between respectable men and the women they exploited. Religion, too, reflected this double standard. Clergymen preached about the sanctity of the family, while scandals periodically erupted involving priests caught in compromising situations. Evangelical reformers campaigned against prostitution, but their rhetoric often placed blame entirely on women, portraying them as seductresses who lured men into sin, rather than victims of structural poverty and male demand. The hypocrisy of Victorian gentlemen was not hidden from all contemporaries. Satirists like George Cruikshank and writers such as Dickens and Thackeray occasionally hinted at the double lives of respectable men, though they often stopped short of direct accusation. Reformers like Butler, however, spoke plainly, accusing society's leaders of sustaining the trade they claimed to abhor. Her speeches emphasized the cruelty of a system where men could sin without consequence while women bore lifelong stigma. The hypocrisy also revealed itself in scandals that punctuated the century. The 1885 maiden tribute of modern Babylon scandal, while ostensibly about child prostitution, implicated prominent men by association, showing how widespread demand was. Earlier, the memoirs of courtesans like Wilson made clear that the sexual economy of Victorian London ran through the highest corridors of power. Yet despite the exposure, systemic change came slowly, as institutions remained designed to protect male reputations. The culture of hypocrisy had consequences far beyond individual behavior. It perpetuated a cycle of exploitation by normalizing male demand, silencing critique, and ensuring that women bore the costs. It distorted the law by directing punishment toward women while shielding men. And it corrupted public discourse by allowing those most complicit to define morality for the nation. The gentleman's hypocrisy thus stands as one of the central truths of Victorian prostitution, that the very men who defined women as fallen were the ones who pushed them into the trade, and the same leaders who preached virtue sustained vice. In the end, this hypocrisy reveals not merely individual failings, but the structure of society built on double standards, where power shielded men from accountability while condemning women to lives of stigma, poverty, and invisibility. The rise of professional policing in 19th century Britain was hailed as a triumph of order and modern governance, with Sir Robert Peel's Metropolitan Police, founded in 1829, portrayed as a rational, disciplined force designed to protect life and property and to impose order on the rapidly expanding metropolis. Yet when it came to prostitution, the record of Victorian policing reveals not the impartial hand of justice, but a deeply compromised system where corruption, selective enforcement, and moral crusading combined to produce a regime that punished women while protecting men, and where the apparatus of law became entangled with the very vice it claimed to suppress. From the outset, policing prostitution posed contradictions. The trade was not technically illegal in Britain. Soliciting, brothel keeping, and related activities could be prosecuted under vagrancy or disorderly house laws, but the act of selling sex itself was not a crime, meaning that enforcement relied on vague charges such as public nuisance or disorderly conduct, charges that gave police broad discretion and created opportunities for abuse. For streetwalkers, this discretion meant constant vulnerability, for constables could arrest women on suspicion alone, often sweeping them off the streets to satisfy public pressure while leaving their clients untouched. Court records show thousands of women fined or imprisoned for solicitation, while prosecutions of male clients were exceedingly rare. The imbalance was structural. Victorian morality defined women as a visible source of vice, while men's participation was invisible, shielded by respectability. This gendered enforcement created an environment ripe for corruption. Police officers often accepted bribes from brothel keepers to ignore their establishments, and testimonies from reformed societies in the 1850s and 1860s reveal patterns of collusion, where certain houses operated openly under police protection while rivals were raided and shut down. Reformers like William Tate condemned the practice, arguing that the police had become complicit in sustaining the trade, while Josephine Butler's Ladies' National Association later accused officers of abusing their powers under the Contagious Diseases Act, subjecting women to arbitrary detention and invasive medical examinations. These acts, passed in stages between 1864 and 1869, gave police in garrison towns and ports authority to detain women suspected of prostitution for compulsory venereal disease examinations, and though justified as a measure to protect soldiers and sailors, in practice they represented an extraordinary extension of state power over poor women. Men remained exempt, and the police were empowered to determine who counted as a prostitute, a power open to abuse. Reports of harassment, wrongful arrests, and sexual coercion proliferated, with some women describing how officers threatened them with detention unless they submitted to demands. Butler described the system as a slave trade under the name of law, denouncing it as both corrupt and degrading. Beyond the Contagious Diseases Act, everyday policing of prostitution was shaped by pressures from local residents, politicians, and moral reformers. Vice squads were formed in cities to target disorderly houses, and newspapers published dramatic accounts of raids, yet these efforts were often more about appearances than effectiveness. Brothels in wealthier districts escaped scrutiny so long as they remained discreet, while poor neighborhoods faced repeated crackdowns. Magistrates imposed fines and short prison sentences on women, measures that did nothing to reduce the trade but instead deepened cycles of poverty, as women left prison stigmatized and unemployable, often returning to the streets immediately. The selective nature of enforcement underscores the hypocrisy of Victorian law. Respectable men could move through brothels with impunity, while poor women bore the full weight of policing. At the same time, constables themselves were notorious clients, with reform reports detailing cases of officers frequenting brothels they were supposed to regulate, sometimes in uniform, and in other cases extorting money or sexual favors under threat of arrest. The blurred line between policing and participation was not an anomaly but a recurring feature of the system, reflecting the inadequacy of laws built on moral panic rather than social reality. The corruption and double standards were periodically exposed in public scandals. In 1870, debates in Parliament erupted over reports of widespread abuse under the Contagious Diseases Act, prompting inquiries into police practices. In the 1880s, the maiden tribute of modern Babylon scandal highlighted how easily police overlooked child prostitution in London until forced into action by public outrage. Reformers argued that the very presence of police in the world of prostitution created opportunities for exploitation, as women were too often treated as criminals rather than victims, and the men in uniform tasked with protecting order were instead perpetuating vice. Yet for all the corruption, the police were also agents of the moral campaigns that sought to reshape public life. Evangelical groups and purity societies pressured officers to raid music halls, theaters, and brothels, seeking to eradicate spaces associated with immorality. These efforts often blurred law enforcement with moral crusading, turning the police into instruments of respectability politics rather than neutral guardians of public safety. The result was a paradoxical system in which prostitution remained ever-present, visible in every city, yet constantly subjected to cycles of suppression, scandal, and resurgence, with women paying the price each time. The broader implications of this policing regime are clear. It institutionalized the double standard that defined Victorian sexuality, normalized the criminalization of poverty, and embedded corruption within the very structures meant to uphold law. Vice squads and constables became both enforcers and participants, persecutors and protectors, reflecting the contradictions of society that proclaimed virtue while sustaining vice. In the end, Victorian policing of prostitution tells us as much about power as it does about sex, revealing a system designed not to eliminate vice but to control it, not to protect women but to discipline them, and not to uphold morality but to maintain appearances for society built on hypocrisy. Few pieces of 19th century legislation capture the hypocrisy, contradictions, and cruelty of Victorian Britain more starkly than the Contagious Diseases Acts, introduced between 1864 and 1869, and enforced for nearly 2 decades before their repeal in 1886. For while framed as measures of public health designed to protect soldiers and sailors from venereal disease, in practice they institutionalized a sexual double standard, granting police and the state extraordinary power over poor women suspected of prostitution, while leaving the men who purchased their bodies completely untouched. The origins of the acts lay in the anxieties of empire and military discipline. By the 1850s, Britain's global reach depended heavily on the health of its armed forces stationed at home and abroad, and venereal disease was regarded by military authorities as a major threat. Reports indicated that up to 1/3 of soldiers in some garrisons suffered from syphilis or gonorrhea, illnesses that incapacitated men for months and drained military resources. Rather than confronting male sexual behavior, Parliament framed the issue as a problem of diseased women corrupting otherwise healthy men. Inspired by regulatory systems in France, where prostitution was supervised by police and medical officers, British lawmakers passed the first Contagious Diseases Act in 1864, covering selected naval ports and garrison towns. The law empowered police to detain any woman suspected of prostitution and subject her to compulsory medical examination. If found infected, she could be confined in a locked hospital for months at a time until deemed cured. Subsequent acts in 1866 and 1869 expanded the system, increasing the range of districts and extending detention periods. By the early 1870s, the Act applied to 18 towns and cities across Britain, including Portsmouth, Devonport, Chatham, and Aldershot. The machinery of enforcement was brutal. Suspicion alone was sufficient to justify arrest, and the definition of a common prostitute was left deliberately vague, allowing constables extraordinary discretion. Women were subjected to invasive examinations with a speculum, procedures that reformers and victims alike described as state-sanctioned assault. Once detained, women were stigmatized permanently. Even if found healthy, their names entered police records, marking them as prostitutes in perpetuity. The system created an underclass of women whose lives were controlled by police, doctors, and magistrates, stripped of privacy, dignity, and rights. No such restrictions applied to men, whether soldiers, sailors, or civilians. They remained free to purchase sex without fear of examination or punishment. This glaring double standard outraged the growing body of reformers, but for nearly a decade the acts operated with little organized resistance, shielded by the prevailing Victorian belief that women bore responsibility for sexual sin. Medical officers defended the laws by pointing to reductions in reported venereal infections among troops, though evidence was inconsistent and critics argued that figures were manipulated. Meanwhile, women endured humiliations that were widely known but rarely discussed in polite society. The turning point came in the late 1860s and early 1870s, when Josephine Butler, a passionate advocate for women's rights, launched a campaign that transformed the debate. A clergyman's wife with no prior political experience, Butler traveled the country denouncing the acts as a system of slavery under the name of law. She founded the Ladies' National Association for the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts in 1869, uniting women across classes in opposition to state regulation of prostitution. Her speeches, often delivered to hostile crowds of men, condemned the moral hypocrisy of laws that branded women as sources of corruption while treating male demand as natural and blameless. Butler insisted that the acts violated fundamental principles of English liberty, subjecting one class of citizens, poor women, to invasive state control without trial or due process. Her campaign faced immense opposition. Politicians dismissed her as hysterical, newspapers ridiculed her, and even some reformers believed regulation was necessary to protect the army. Yet Butler's movement grew, fueled by testimonies from women who had endured examinations, by support from nonconformist religious groups, and by growing recognition that the acts did not reduce disease but instead entrenched exploitation. By the 1870s, the repeal campaign had become one of the most prominent social movements in Britain, linking women's rights, civil liberties, and public morality in a way that foreshadowed later feminist struggles. Parliamentary inquiries in the 1870s and 1880s increasingly heard evidence of abuses, including wrongful arrests, police corruption, and the spread of infection within locked hospitals themselves. Critics demonstrated that the acts merely displaced prostitution rather than controlling it, driving women out of regulated districts into unregulated ones. At the same time, the laws deepened the stigma of prostitution, branding women permanently as contagious even when healthy. International observers noted the cruelty of the British system, and the campaign for repeal gathered momentum. Finally, in 1886, after nearly 2 decades of resistance, Parliament voted to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts, ending state regulation of prostitution in Britain. For reformers, repeal was a triumph of justice, liberty, and moral consistency, but the scars of the system lingered. Thousands of women had endured invasive examinations, months of confinement, and lifelong stigma, while the men who sustained demand were never held accountable. The acts remain emblematic of Victorian hypocrisy, a society that proclaimed itself a guardian of morality and empire, yet constructed laws that institutionalized gender inequality, criminalized poverty, and sanctioned the control of women's bodies in the name of public health. They reveal the extent to which Victorian Britain preferred to manage vice rather than confront the structures of inequality and demand that sustained it, and they stand as a reminder of how the language of health and morality can be twisted to justify exploitation when society refuses to challenge its own double standards. No aspect of Victorian prostitution terrified society more than the spectre of disease, for while poverty and morality could be debated in sermons and newspapers, venereal illness confronted the nation with a reality it could neither ignore nor easily contain, spreading silently through brothels, barracks, and even respectable homes, leaving disfigurement, infertility, and death in its wake, and exposing the cost of a system that condemned women while excusing men. By the mid-19th century, syphilis and gonorrhea were endemic in Britain, and medical officers estimated that 1 in 5 soldiers and sailors suffered from venereal disease at any given time. Reports from the 1860s revealed that in some garrison towns, infection incapacitated nearly a third of enlisted men, prompting military and political leaders to view prostitution not as a social question but as a threat to national defense. Physicians like William Acton, whose 1857 study prostitution, considered in its moral, social, and sanitary aspect became a standard text, argued that prostitution was both inevitable and dangerous, a necessary evil to satisfy male desire, yet a vector of contagion that had to be controlled. His writings reveal the contradictions of Victorian medicine. Women were identified as the carriers of disease, subject to medical inspection and confinement, while men were seen as victims, their role in spreading infection largely ignored. Treatment for venereal disease was primitive and often more harmful than the illness itself. Mercury ointments and pills were the standard remedy for syphilis, producing severe side effects such as tremors, tooth loss, and kidney damage. In some cases, patients endured months of mercury courses, leading to the grim saying, "A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury." Gonorrhea was treated with painful injections of silver nitrate, while other experimental remedies included iodine, opium, and even arsenic. Effective cures would not arrive until the advent of penicillin in the 20th century, meaning that most Victorians lived with chronic symptoms, disfigurement, or premature death. The stigma of disease was gendered. Prostitutes suspected of infection were imprisoned in lock hospitals, where they endured invasive examinations and months of isolation, while men who contracted the same diseases were quietly treated in military or private hospitals, their respectability preserved. Doctors wrote extensively about the dangers of common prostitutes spreading infection to innocent wives and children, ignoring the obvious role of husbands as vectors. Middle-class women, bound by ideals of chastity, often suffered in silence, contracting syphilis from husbands who frequented brothels. Medical journals of the 1870s reported cases of congenital syphilis in infants passed from mother to child during pregnancy, leading to stillbirth, blindness, and deformities. These tragedies expose the hypocrisy of blaming women alone, but the structure of Victorian morality ensured that prostitutes bore the brunt of blame and control. Disease also reinforced a cultural image of the fallen woman. Reformed literature described prostitutes as diseased, dangerous, and contagious, not only physically but morally. Satirical prints depicted syphilitic women as decaying figures, warning men of the risks of indulgence. Yet despite these warnings, demand remained constant, sustained by the belief that men's desires were natural and uncontrollable. For prostitutes themselves, disease was both occupational hazard and death sentence. Testimonies collected by reformers and medical officers described women whose bodies were ravaged by syphilis, whose faces bore ulcers, whose voices failed from throat infections, and whose lives ended in early graves. Lock hospitals, established in the 18th century and expanded under the Contagious Diseases Acts, became sites of both treatment and punishment, where women were confined under the guise of care but subjected to harsh discipline and loss of freedom. The medical gaze, clinical, detached, and often moralizing, reduced women to specimens, their bodies examined, classified, and recorded as evidence of social vice. Yet even as prostitutes were stigmatized as vectors of contagion, the spread of disease revealed a broader reality. Venereal illness did not remain confined to the slums or the barracks, but penetrated every layer of society, carried by men who moved freely between brothels, homes, and colonial postings. Physicians quietly acknowledged that cases of syphilis appeared among the middle and upper classes, yet public discourse continued to frame the disease as a problem of the poor, sustaining the illusion that respectability was immune to vice. The intersection of prostitution, disease, and medicine thus reveals the deepest hypocrisies of Victorian Britain. A society obsessed with purity constructed laws and medical systems that violated women in the name of health, excused men in the name of necessity, and ignored the structural poverty that drove women into prostitution in the first place. The medical profession, far from neutral, reinforced these inequalities, using the language of science to justify control. Reformers like Josephine Butler denounced the medical assault of women under the Contagious Diseases Act, insisting that true health could not be achieved through injustice. By the late 19th century, advances in bacteriology and public health began to reshape understanding of disease, but the stigma endured, and prostitutes continued to be cast as both cause and consequence of venereal contagion. In the end, The story of disease in Victorian prostitution is one of bodies caught at the intersection of poverty, medicine, and morality, where suffering was compounded by stigma, where treatment was indistinguishable from punishment, and where the failure to hold men accountable ensured that contagion spread unchecked. It is a story that strips away the veneer of Victorian respectability to reveal a society willing to sacrifice women's dignity, health, and lives in order to preserve the illusion of male innocence and national strength. Victorian prostitution was not merely a moral concern or a medical problem, but a vast underground economy, a market of flesh that functioned with its own structures of supply, demand, profit, and exploitation, feeding off poverty and sustaining itself through layers of intermediaries, from landlords and brothel keepers to pimps, procurers, and even respectable businessmen who invested discreetly in vice. And to understand it requires stripping away the rhetoric of morality to reveal the hard economics that made prostitution both widespread and resilient throughout the 19th century. Contemporary observers estimated that London alone contained between 50,000 and 80,000 prostitutes at mid-century, with other major cities such as Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham also hosting large populations of sex workers, and this scale could not have existed without a commercial infrastructure that drew thousands of women into its orbit. For most, prostitution was not lucrative glamour but desperate survival. Wages for unskilled women's labor were pitiful, with seamstresses, laundresses, and domestic servants often owning only a few shillings a week, barely enough to cover food and rent. By contrast, a single evening of prostitution could yield several shillings, and for women facing eviction, hunger, or the needs of children, the economic calculation was stark. Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor contains testimony from women who explained bluntly that prostitution provided the difference between starvation and survival, even if only temporarily. Yet while individual earnings might appear higher than conventional women's work, the structure of exploitation ensured that most of this income was siphoned off. Brothel keepers typically took substantial shares of women's earnings. Landlords profited from inflated rents on rooms used for sex, and pimps and procurers trapped women in cycles of debt or dependency. Clothing, essential for attracting clients, was often provided on credit at exorbitant rates, binding women to keepers who acted as creditors as well as employers. Alcohol, widely used to dull the dangers and degradations of the trade, became another tool of dependency, sold at inflated prices within brothels and music halls. The economics of prostitution thus functioned less as a route to independence than as a cycle of entrapment, where women's labor enriched others while leaving them vulnerable to poverty and disease. At the higher end of the market, courtesans and mistresses supported by wealthy men occupied a different economic world, enjoying apartments, carriages, and allowances that provided comfort and even celebrity. Figures such as Harriet Wilson and Catherine Walters became known in society for their beauty, wit, and connections, and their memoirs reveal the transactional nature of relationships with politicians, aristocrats, and even royalty. Yet even here, financial security was fragile, dependent on the favor of patrons, and vulnerable to scandal or aging. The vast majority of women never approached such status, remaining instead in the precarious world of streetwalking and cheap brothels. The demand side of the market was equally structured. Industrial cities with large populations of unmarried men created steady demand, and wages from factories, docks, and military pay provided the disposable income that sustained the trade. Soldiers and sailors were particularly central, their presence in garrison towns and ports creating economies where prostitution became entwined with local business. Tavern owners, lodging housekeepers, and even cab drivers profited from the circulation of clients to brothels. Respectable businessmen also played hidden roles, investing in properties used for vice or extending credit to brothel keepers. The market of flesh thus intersected with a legitimate economy, blurring lines between respectability and vice. The state itself, through its military and naval expenditures, indirectly sustained demand while refusing to address the economic conditions that drove women into supply. The scale of profit in prostitution attracted criminal networks, particularly in the late century with growing fears of white slavery. While some of these fears were exaggerated, evidence does show organized trafficking of women across borders, facilitated by procurers who promised domestic service or marriage abroad only to deliver victims into brothels. Parliamentary reports from the 1880s documented such cases, revealing the international dimensions of an economy rooted in exploitation. Yet the economics of prostitution were not only about exploitation, but also about resilience. Women often demonstrated ingenuity in navigating the trade, pooling resources, working collectively, or negotiating with clients to secure slightly better terms. Some left the trade and used savings to open shops or lodging houses, though these stories were exceptions rather than norms. For most, the structure of exploitation was too strong, with poverty, stigma, and dependency ensuring continued vulnerability. What makes the market of flesh most revealing is how deeply it was interwoven with the wider economy of Victorian Britain. Landlords, tradesmen, policemen, and even politicians drew income, favors, or advantage from prostitution, making it less an isolated underworld and a shadow economy that propped up the very society that denounced it. Respectable homes and institutions benefited indirectly, whether through rent, wages spent in shops, or taxes collected on properties used for brothels. The moral outrage of reformers often ignored these economic entanglements, focusing on individual women while leaving untouched the structures of profit that sustained the trade. In the end, Victorian prostitution was not simply a story of fallen women, but of a market that commodified human bodies, extracting labor and profit in ways that mirrored the broader exploitation of industrial capitalism. The women who sold sex were both participants in and victims of this market, navigating choices shaped less by morality than by necessity, while the men who sustained demand and the figures who profited from supply remained shielded by respectability. The economics of prostitution thus expose a lie at the heart of Victorian morality, that a society built on exploitation could condemn one form of survival while profiting from it at every level. By the final decades of the 19th century, the question of prostitution in Britain became inseparable from a new and explosive phrase that dominated headlines, sermons, and parliamentary debates: the so-called white slave trade, a term that combined the language of abolition with sensational images of young girls lured, kidnapped, or sold into sexual bondage. And while the reality of child trafficking was tragically present in Britain long before the phrase gained currency, it was the panic of the 1870s and 1880s that transformed the issue into a national scandal, exposing both the vulnerability of children in industrial society and the hypocrisies of a culture that ignored exploitation until it was dramatized with enough force to shock middle-class readers into action. Child prostitution was already well documented by mid-century observers such as Henry Mayhew, William Tate, and William Acton, who reported girls as young as 12 in London's brothels, often drawn in by poverty or sold by desperate parents. The age of consent in Britain, set at 12 until 1875 and then only raised to 13, left enormous legal room for abuse, while police indifference and corruption ensured that few perpetrators were punished. Reformers like Josephine Butler condemned this system for decades, but their appeals struggled against entrenched beliefs that women were to blame for their own downfall. What changed in the 1880s was not the sudden appearance of child trafficking, but the sensational exposure of it by the press. In July 1885, the Pall Mall Gazette, under the editorship of William Thomasstead, launched a series entitled The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, a lurid expose that described in graphic detail the supposed trade in young girls across London. Stead, a radical journalist committed to using shock tactics for reform, orchestrated a sting operation in which he arranged the purchase of 13-year-old girl Eliza Armstrong from a mother for £5, under the pretense of placing her in domestic service, but in reality to demonstrate how easily a child could be procured for sexual exploitation. Stead's series combined melodramatic narrative, biblical allusions, and moral outrage, presenting London as a modern Babylon in which innocence was betrayed nightly under the eyes of complacent public. The articles caused a sensation, with newspapers selling out within hours, crowds gathering to read pasted excerpts in shop windows, and Parliament forced into emergency debate. Stead's work revealed to a mass audience what reformers had long claimed, that children were vulnerable to trafficking and that legal protections were grossly inadequate. The outcry was immense. Religious leaders, women's groups, and social reformers rallied behind demand for reform, while conservative critics denounced Stead for obscenity and sensationalism. The immediate legislative result was the Criminal Law Amendment Act of August 1885, which raised the age of consent to 16, strengthened penalties for procuring, and expanded police powers against brothels. It was one of the most significant victories for the social purity movement of the century, yet it came at enormous personal cost to Stead, who was prosecuted for abduction in the Armstrong case and sentenced to 3 months in prison. His imprisonment underscored the ambiguities of the panic. He had exposed real vulnerabilities, but through methods that themselves exploited a child, and while he achieved reform, he also revealed how dependent Victorian society was on spectacle and scandal to act against injustice. The phrase white slavery quickly took root, used to describe both domestic child trafficking and the international movement of women for prostitution. Campaigners in Britain and across Europe warned of networks luring girls abroad under false pretenses of welcome marriage, only to force them into brothels in Paris, Brussels, or Buenos Aires. Some of these fears were grounded in documented cases. Parliamentary reports in the 1880s and 1890s collected testimony of women trafficked across borders, often through the ports of Liverpool and Southampton. Yet much of the rhetoric was exaggerated, infused with xenophobia and imperial anxiety, portraying foreign traffickers as predators threatening British purity. The panic about white slavery thus blended genuine concern for child victims with broader cultural fears about immigration, degeneration, and the decline of national virtue. Reform campaigns multiplied in response. Organizations such as the National Vigilance Association, founded in 1885, dedicated themselves to combating trafficking, prosecuting procurers, and pressuring authorities to act. The Salvation Army, already active in campaigns of poor, threw itself into rescue work, raiding brothels, offering refuge to exploited girls, and publicizing stories of salvation to raise both funds and awareness. Josephine Butler, though sometimes wary of sensationalism, welcomed the public attention as a breakthrough in her long struggle, seeing the panic as an opportunity to highlight the broader injustices of the system. Yet even as reforms were achieved, the panic itself carried distortions. By focusing on sensational cases of abduction and trafficking, the press often ignored the more common reality that most child prostitutes were driven into the trade by poverty, neglect, and systemic inequality rather than by organized gangs. The narrative of the innocent maiden kidnapped by shadowy traffickers obscured the harsher truth that Britain's own economy and laws left children vulnerable. Moreover, the language of white slavery carried racial and imperial overtones, implying that the outrage was magnified because the victims were white, while the empire's tolerance of sexual exploitation in colonies received less scrutiny. The panic thus reveals as much about Victorian anxieties as it does about the exploitation itself. It reflected a society deeply uncomfortable with its own contradictions, proud of its empire yet fearful of moral decay, obsessed with purity yet complicit in vice, committed to protecting children yet unwilling to address the poverty and inequality that endangered them. The reforms of 1885 did make a difference, raising the age of consent and curbing some practices of trafficking, but they did not end child prostitution, which continued in the shadows of slums and lodging houses into the 20th century. What they did achieve was to cement the role of moral outrage, media scandal, and public panic as catalysts for reform in Victorian Britain. In the end, the white slave panic of the 1880s stands as both a victory and a cautionary tale. A victory because it forced long overdue legal changes that protected children, and a caution because it showed how easily genuine suffering could be transformed into sensational narrative, how quickly reform could become entangled with xenophobia and moral theater, and how deeply hypocrisy ran in a society that needed scandal to act against exploitation it had tolerated for generations. In the vast literature of Victorian prostitution, parliamentary reports, medical treatises, reform pamphlets, and sensational journalism, the voices of the women themselves are often the faintest, filtered through the judgments of magistrates, reformers, or moralists, yet in scattered testimonies, interviews, diaries, and memoirs, their words survive, fragile but powerful, reminding us that behind the trope of the fallen woman were individuals with stories of survival, endurance, and sometimes defiance, voices that speak from the shadows to challenge the stereotypes imposed upon them. Henry Mayhew's monumental London Labour and the London Poor, published in the 1850s, contained some of the earliest and most direct testimonies from sex workers. Mayhew interviewed women working in the streets of London, recording their speech as faithfully as possible, capturing both the harshness of their lives and the pragmatism with which they viewed their choices. One woman, identified only as a girl of 16, described her entry into prostitution with brutal simplicity. "I was a servant, but they turned me away because I was out late. I had no money, no friends. I slept out 2 nights, and then I went with a man because I must." Another told Mayhew, "We are not what you think we are. I never deceived nobody. I never robbed nobody. I took to it to live." These words strip away layers of moral judgment and reveal a reality where prostitution was less a moral choice than a desperate necessity, a survival strategy in a city that offered women little else. Court transcripts likewise preserve fragments of women's voices, though framed by hostile systems. In trials of brothel keepers, procurers, or under the Contagious Diseases Act, prostitutes were called to testify, often under duress. A case from 1870 recorded a 14-year-old girl telling magistrates, "My mother sent me to the house. She said it was for work, but it was not for work." Another witness described being beaten when she tried to leave a brothel, stating simply, "I wanted to go, but they said I owed them money." Such testimonies, stripped of elaboration, lay bare the coercion, violence, and betrayal at the heart of the system. Rescue organizations such as the Salvation Army also preserved narratives, though often reshaped to highlight redemption. The Army's war cry newspaper published stories of fallen women rescued from brothels or streets, emphasizing their conversion to Christianity and re-entry into respectable life. One account described a young woman who told rescuers, "I thought no one cared for me, no one in the world. When I saw you come for me, I could not believe it." These testimonies, though framed to serve evangelical purposes, nonetheless conveyed a profound isolation and longing for recognition expressed by many women. Yet not all voices were mediated through reformers. Memoirs and autobiographies by courtesans reveal a different side of prostitution, one of wit, agency, and sometimes bitterness toward the society that condemned them. Harriet Wilson's memoirs, published in 1825, though earlier than the height of the Victorian period, remained widely read and scandalous, as she recounted affairs with aristocrats, mocking their hypocrisy and exposing their private lives. "I shall not say why and how I became, at the age of 15, the mistress of the Earl of Craven," he declared, "but I will tell the truth about the truth." Wilson's candid voice both titillated and horrified readers, but her words refused to fit the mold of the passive fallen woman. Later courtesans such as Catherine Walters, though less literary, used their celebrity to control their own narratives, negotiating with patrons and cultivating reputations that challenged Victorian ideals of female submission. Between these extremes, anonymous streetwalkers in Mayhew's pages and glamorous courtesans in memoirs, lay countless women whose words surface only briefly in letters, petitions, and rescue records. In 1869, a group of women detained under the Contagious Diseases Act in Devonport wrote a petition protesting their treatment, declaring, "We are dragged to the hospital against our will, examined in a way no modest woman could endure, and held like prisoners while the men go free." Their collective voice, raw and indignant, stands as one of the earliest articulations of women protesting state control of their bodies. Diaries and letters, though rarer, sometimes survive in archives. One young woman, identified in reform literature as E.S., left a diary describing her life in London streets, writing, "I do not love it, but I cannot leave it. The cold and hunger would be worse. People think we do it for wickedness. They do not know how hard it is." Her words convey both resignation and resistance, a refusal to accept society's framing of her life as merely sinful. Other testimonies come through the voices of reformers who recorded conversations verbatim. Josephine Butler's papers include transcript of interviews with prostitutes who joined her campaign. One woman told her, "You fight for us, but they will not hear you. They say we are nothing, but we are women, same as them." This assertion of shared womanhood directly challenged the Victorian ideology that divided respectable and fallen into separate moral categories. Even in hostile courtrooms, women sometimes pushed back. In an 1872 trial, a prostitute accused of soliciting replied to the magistrate, "The gentlemen come to us, sir, not we to them." Though punished, her words punctured the silence around male responsibility. These fragments together form a counter-narrative to the dominant imagery of Victorian prostitution. They show women articulating their own experiences as survivors of poverty, as critics of hypocrisy, as seekers of dignity, and as individuals refusing to be silenced. They remind us that while reformers and journalists often spoke about prostitutes, the women themselves had their own words, their own truths. The survival of these voices is itself remarkable, for they were not meant to endure. Many were dismissed as untrustworthy, scandalous, or irrelevant. Yet when pieced together, they reveal a chorus of testimony that humanizes the abstract fallen woman into real people negotiating impossible choices. They complicate the stereotype perpetuated by art and literature, showing that prostitutes were not merely tragic victims or cunning temptresses, but workers, mothers, daughters, and individuals with agency, however constrained. Their words speak across the gulf of time, reminding us that Victorian society's condemnation could not entirely erase their humanity, and that even in the shadows, they found ways to assert their voices. The late Victorian era witnessed an extraordinary surge of activism around the issue of prostitution, and at its heart stood the reformers and rescuers, men and women who entered slums, brothels, and political chambers to combat what they saw as a national disgrace, a social sin, and a moral blight on Britain's empire. Their campaigns ranged from the evangelical zeal of the Salvation Army, staging dramatic midnight raids to rescue women from brothels, to the fiery feminist oratory of Josephine Butler, who thundered against the Contagious Diseases Acts and the sexual double standard before hostile crowds of men. Together, these movements shaped public debate, influenced legislation, and gave new visibility to women's voices in politics, yet they also reveal the tensions of Victorian reform, between compassion and control, between genuine concern for suffering and the urge to impose middle-class respectability upon those they sought to save. The Salvation Army, founded in 1865 by William and Catherine Booth, was the most visible evangelical force in London's underworld. By the 1880s, the army had established rescue homes across Britain, often located near districts notorious for prostitution, where fallen women could find shelter, food, and the prospect of conversion. These homes were structured like barracks, with strict rules, daily prayer, and training in domestic skills. Salvationists believed that no woman was beyond redemption, but they also believed that redemption required complete transformation, often demanding that women sever ties with their past lives and accept the authority of religious discipline. Army officers staged rescue raids, marching into brothels with hymns and prayers, sometimes physically removing women against the wishes of keepers or pimps. These acts were celebrated in army publications such as The War Cry, which published stirring accounts of women weeping as they were delivered from vice. Critics, however, accused the army of theatricality and coercion, arguing that women were treated less as individuals than as trophies of salvation. The symbolism of rescue, however, resonated deeply with the Victorian public, galvanizing the nations and drawing attention to the plight of prostitutes in ways no government report had achieved. Alongside the army, other evangelical groups such as the London Female Mission, the Church of England Rescue Societies, and the Young Women's Christian Association, YWCA, established refuges, training schools, and protective lodging houses. Their efforts focused not only on reclaiming prostitutes, but on preventing girls from falling in the first place, offering lodging, sewing classes, and employment support to young women arriving in cities. These initiatives reflected the Victorian belief that female virtue was fragile, requiring constant vigilance, yet they also provided practical alternatives in an economy that left many women with no choices but service, factory work, or the streets. The rhetoric of these missions often portrayed prostitutes as lost lambs, strayed from the flock, awaiting the shepherd's return. It was a language of pity more than empowerment. Yet for many women it offered at least a temporary reprieve from the brutalities of brothel life. While evangelicals framed prostitution as sin to be conquered, Josephine Butler framed it as injustice to be overturned. A clergyman's wife from Liverpool, Butler entered public life in 1869 with a campaign that would define her career, the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts. These acts, which allowed police to detain and forcibly examine women suspected of prostitution in garrison towns, horrified Butler, who saw them as institutionalized sexual slavery. She launched the Ladies' National Association for the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Act, mobilizing middle-class women in an unprecedented political movement. Butler's speeches were remarkable for their passion and their willingness to speak openly about sexual matters in a culture that considered them unspeakable. She condemned the act as a degradation of womanhood and accused the state of protecting men while sacrificing women. Facing jeers, insults, and even physical threats, Butler persevered, building a nationwide network of activists, gathering petitions with tens of thousands of signatures, and forcing Parliament to confront the issue. Her work brought women into political activism on a scale never before seen in Britain, laying foundation for the suffrage movement that would follow. Butler's movement was radical in its critique of male privilege, yet it too was framed by Victorian ideals of morality. She saw prostitution as a product of male lust and systemic inequality, but her vision of women's liberation was bound to chastity and Christian virtue. For Butler, the prostitute was not a worker asserting agency, but a victim of male power who needed protection. Her activism achieved monumental victories, the suspension of the acts in 1883 and their repeal in 1886, but it also reinforced a view of prostitutes as symbols of suffering rather than as independent voices. Other reformers, such as the National Vigilance Association founded in 1885, focused on law enforcement. Spurred by the white slave panic and William T. Stead's maiden tribute of modern Babylon expose, the association pursued prosecutions of pimps and procurers, lobbied for international treaties against trafficking, and organized citizen patrols to monitor music halls and public places. Their work exposed trafficking networks, but also slipped into moral policing, targeting popular entertainment, and imposing middle-class standards on working-class leisure. This tension between genuine protection and social control ran through all reform movements. The YWCA and other preventive organizations sought to insulate young women from temptation, but their programs often enforced rigid domestic training, channeling women into service roles with little regard for personal aspirations. The Salvation Army saved lives, but in doing so it demanded conformity to evangelical discipline. Butler championed liberty and justice, but her rhetoric denied the possibility that women could choose sex work as economic agency. Prostitutes themselves often viewed reformers with ambivalence. Some accepted rescue as a path out of exploitation. Others resisted, seeing reform homes as another form of control. Testimonies from women who left refuges after only days described the suffocating discipline, the endless prayers, the lack of autonomy. Reformers spoke about prostitutes far more than they listened to them. Yet despite these contradictions, the impact of the reformers and rescues was profound. They brought prostitution out of the shadows and into the center of public debate. They reshaped law, raising the age of consent, repealing oppressive acts, and increasing penalties for trafficking. They mobilized women into political activism, challenging the silence imposed by Victorian respectability. They demonstrated the power of moral outrage to force Parliament to act. And they created institutions, rescue homes, vigilant societies, advocacy networks that persisted into the 20th century. Their legacy is double-edged. They alleviated suffering but also imposed discipline. They fought injustice but also reinforced moral judgment. In the end, the story of the reformers and rescuers is inseparable from the story of Victorian prostitution itself. Few forces in Victorian Britain were as powerful as respectability, a social currency that determined who was honored and who was disgraced, who could rise and who would fall. And in the realm of prostitution, respectability dictated not only individual reputations, but the very structure of law, policing, and public morality, creating a double standard so entrenched that it shaped every discussion of sex, gender, and class. To understand prostitution in the 19th century, one must understand how respectability functioned as both shield and sword, protecting men of status while condemning women of poverty, elevating the sins of the powerful into private indulgences while transforming the survival strategies of the powerless into public crimes. Respectability was not merely an abstract concept, but a visible performance, measured by appearance, dress, manners, and associations. 4 middle and upper class men, attending church, keeping a household, supporting charities, and maintaining public decorum were enough to preserve reputations even when private lives contradicted every standard. Politicians, magistrates, and businessmen who visited brothels or kept mistresses could still appear in public as moral leaders, so long as their affairs remained discreet. For women, however, respectability was infinitely more fragile. A single accusation of sexual impropriety, an arrest for soliciting, or even an association with suspected prostitutes could ruin reputations permanently, closing of employment, marriage, and social acceptance. The law reflected this imbalance. Soliciting charges, vagrancy prosecutions, and the enforcement of the Contagious Diseases Acts targeted women almost exclusively. Police officers had discretionary power to decide who appeared respectable and who did not, often judging by dress, neighborhood, or even time of day. A woman walking alone at night in a poor district could be assumed to be a prostitute, while a man in evening dress emerging from a brothel was assumed to be a gentleman on private business. Magistrates echoed this bias, issuing fines and prison sentences to women while rarely pursuing clients. Respectability thus functioned as a legal boundary. Women without it were criminalized, men with it were shielded. Class deepened the double standard. Wealthy courtesans and mistresses, such as Harriet Wilson or Catherine Walters, could achieve a kind of notoriety that bordered on celebrity. Their liaisons with aristocrats and politicians, while scandalous, did not erase their access to luxury or influence, and their memoirs and public appearances sometimes even earned them admiration. By contrast, poor streetwalkers in Whitechapel or Manchester faced constant harassment, arrest, and violence, with no chance of recasting their stories as glamour. The same act, selling sex, was judged not by morality but by class and visibility. Literature and journalism reinforced these distinctions. Middle-class writers constructed the figure of the fallen woman as a tragic victim, often deserving pity as she was young and seduced, but contempt as she was hardened and poor. This moral hierarchy allowed reformers to claim sympathy for innocent girls while abandoning older, poorer prostitutes to stigma. Respectability thus operated as a filter through which compassion was rationed and condemnation justified. The hypocrisy of this system was obvious to contemporaries, though rarely acknowledged publicly. Reformers like Josephine Butler highlighted it relentlessly, pointing out that male demand was treated as natural while female supply was treated as deviant. Prostitutes themselves sometimes voiced their frustration in court or testimony, insisting that gentlemen come to us, not we to them. Yet the machinery of respectability silenced these voices, ensuring that society could maintain its illusion of moral order while perpetuating exploitation. Respectability also functioned as social control. For working-class communities, maintaining respectability was a way to claim dignity against poverty. Families worked to distance themselves from neighbors suspected of prostitution, and reformers sought to protect young women from falling by channeling them into domestic service, where wages were low but reputations could remain intact. Respectability thus operated not only at the level of law and elite hypocrisy, but within daily life, shaping choices and opportunities for women of all classes. The stakes were high. Loss of respectability meant exclusion from employment, charity, and community support. For many women, this exclusion pushed them further into prostitution, creating a vicious cycle where stigma reinforced dependence. Even in the courts of law, respectability determined credibility. Testimony from prostitutes was often dismissed as unreliable, regardless of accuracy, while the word of a gentleman carried weight. This imbalance shielded abusers and traffickers from prosecution, as women's accounts were disbelieved or ridiculed. The very act of being identified as a prostitute stripped a woman of legal standing, effectively making her invisible as a citizen. Respectability also intersected with empire. Abroad, British officials condemned prostitution among colonized peoples while tacitly relying on it for soldiers and administrators, preserving their own reputations as civilizing forces while ignoring the realities of exploitation. At home, the rhetoric of empire was invoked to frame prostitution as a threat to national strength, especially when linked to venereal disease in the army, yet always the blame was placed on women, never on the men who demanded their services. In the final analysis, the law of respectability was less about morality than about power. It allowed men of status to indulge without consequence, punish poor women for survival, and preserve the illusion of a moral society while vice flourished in every city. It was enforced by police discretion, sustained by class prejudice, and justified by cultural narratives that equated female worth with chastity and male worth with discretion. Its legacy persisted long after the Victorian age, shaping social attitude towards sex work well into the 20th century. In exposing this system, one sees clearly the central hypocrisy of Victorian Britain, that respectability, far from being a measure of virtue, was a mask, a shield for the privileged, and a weapon against the vulnerable, ensuring that the same act of prostitution could be a scandal, a crime, or a curiosity depending not on morality but on class, gender, and reputation. Victorian Britain's fascination with prostitution was not confined to parliamentary debates, police reports, or reform campaigns. It also found expression in the cultural imagination, where novels, plays, pamphlets, journalism, and visual art repeatedly returned to the figure of the fallen woman, a symbolic archetype that embodied society's anxieties about sex, morality, class, and female agency. This trope, endlessly repeated, became one of the most enduring cultural creations of the 19th century, shaping how Victorians understood prostitutes not as workers or individuals, but as symbols of moral decline, tragic victims, or dangerous seductresses. Literature was central in establishing this imagery. Charles Dickens, one of the most influential voices of the age, touched repeatedly on prostitution, though often obliquely. In Oliver Twist, 1837 to 1839, the character of Nancy remains one of the most memorable representations of a prostitute in Victorian fiction. Nancy is compassionate, self-sacrificing, and ultimately tragic, caught between loyalty to Bill Sikes and sympathy for Oliver. Dickens never explicitly names a profession, but his readers understood the implications, and her violent death at the hands of Sikes became a morality tale about the inevitable fate of women who strayed. Nancy's humanity softened the harshest stereotypes, but she was still bound to the tragic arc of the fallen woman. She could be redeemed only through suffering and death, not through survival or agency. Other writers reinforce this pattern. Elizabeth Gaskell's Mary Barton, 1848, and Ruth, 1853, portrayed working-class women seduced and abandoned, doomed by loss of chastity. In Ruth, The protagonist falls from grace after seduction by a wealthy man, spends her life in repentance, and dies heroically during a cholera outbreak, a narrative that reinforced the idea that once fallen, a woman's only path to redemption was self-sacrifice. William Makepeace Thackeray's Vanity Fair, 1848, offered Becky Sharp, a more ambiguous figure who used charm and wit to manipulate men, but her immorality served as cautionary satire rather than as social critique. These novels reveal the limited imaginative space afforded to women outside respectability. They could be pitted, mocked, or destroyed, but rarely allowed to live as complex, autonomous individuals. Popular literature beyond canonical novels also trafficked heavily in the fallen woman trope. Cheap pamphlets, sensational novels, and broadsides circulated lurid tales of seduction, ruin, and death, often sold in working-class neighborhoods as moral entertainment. Titles like The Victim of Seduction or The Ruined Milliner warned young women of the dangers of straying from virtue, while simultaneously titillating readers with detailed accounts of decline. These stories reflected and reinforced middle-class anxieties about urbanization, class mixing, and female independence. The theater, too, capitalized on the trope. Melodramas staged at popular venues such as the Surrey and Britannia theaters often featured fallen women who ended in madness, suicide, or deathbed repentance, spectacles designed to evoke tears while reaffirming moral order. The visual arts paralleled these themes. Painters of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, such as Dante Gabriel Rossetti, William Holman Hunt, and Ford Madox Brown, produced striking images of fallen women, often infused with symbolism of sin and redemption. Hunt's The Awakening Conscience, 1853, depicted a kept mistress rising in sudden recognition of a degraded state, bathed in divine light as she realizes a moral fall. Brown's Take Your Son, Sir, 1857 to 1860, portrayed a woman presenting an illegitimate child to its absent father, her face filled with anguish and defiance. These works, exhibited at the Royal Academy, sparked debate about the morality of art, with critics praising their moral message while some accused them of prurience. Engravings and prints carried such imagery into middle-class homes, ensuring that the fallen woman became a cultural icon as well as a social reality. Journalism likewise perpetuated the trope. Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor presented prostitutes' testimonies, but his framing often reinforced stereotypes, describing women as degraded or diseased even as they spoke in their own words. William Acton's medical texts, widely read by policymakers and reformers, declared prostitutes necessary to male health yet doomed to decline, further embedding the idea that prostitution was synonymous with decay. Sensational exposés in papers like the Pall Mall Gazette during the maiden tribute scandal described child victims with melodramatic imagery, emphasizing innocence betrayed, while rarely portraying adult sex workers as anything but corruptors. The fallen woman thus became a cultural shorthand, invoked in debates about morality, reform, and art. She embodied the consequences of sexual transgression, the dangers of poverty, and the anxieties of urban modernity. Yet she was also a figure onto whom society projected its contradictions, compassion mixed with condemnation, fascination with repulsion, pity with voyeurism. The trope's endurance lay in its flexibility. It could warn daughters, entertain readers, inspire reform, or justify repression. Its ubiquity, however, silenced real women's lives. Few cultural works presented prostitutes as workers navigating economic realities. Few allowed them survival, agency, or dignity. Instead, culture insisted that their stories end in ruin, repentance, or death, reinforcing the belief that respectability once lost could never be regained. Yet cracks in the trope appeared. Courtesans like Harriet Wilson mocked the men who condemned them, publishing memoirs that exposed hypocrisy. Satirical prints by artists like George Cruikshank lampooned respectable men's double lives, and reformers like Josephine Butler challenged the narrative, insisting that prostitutes were victims of social injustice rather than moral corruption. These alternative voices never erased the dominance of the fallen woman trope, but they complicated it, ensuring that cultural memory was not monolithic. In retrospect, the trope reveals as much about Victorian society as about the women it claimed to represent. It shows a culture struggling with rapid urbanization, shifting gender roles, and class tensions, using symbolic women to negotiate fears about stability and morality. It shows how art and literature can both humanize and dehumanize, offering sympathy while denying agency. And it shows how cultural imagination can entrench stereotypes that outlast the realities they claim to depict. The fallen woman remained one of Victorian Britain's most enduring myths, shaping public perception of prostitution long after the voices of real women had been silenced. In the autumn of 1888, the long-simmering anxieties of Victorian Britain about prostitution, poverty, and urban disorder converge in one of the most infamous crime sprees in modern history. The Whitechapel murders attributed to the unidentified figure who came to be known as Jack the Ripper, killings that turned the spotlight of the world onto the East End of London and, for a brief and terrible moment, exposed the daily vulnerability of the city's poorest women, almost all of them prostitutes, eking out survival in the narrow streets and lodging houses of Whitechapel. The murders began in late August with the discovery of Marian Nichols in Bucks Row, her throat cut and body mutilated, followed in quick succession by Annie Chapman in Hanbury Street, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the so-called double-event night of September 30th, and Mary Jane Kelly in Miller's Court on November 9th, her murder the most horrific of all. Each victim was a woman living in desperate poverty, often resorting to prostitution to pay for a bed in a lodging house or for gin to numb the cold. Their lives have been marked by hardship, abandonment, or illness, their names recorded in poorhouse registers, police dockets, and coroner's reports. The brutality of their deaths shocked Britain, but equally revealing was how their lives have been ignored until their violent ends forced attention. Newspapers seized on the killings with unprecedented sensationalism, publishing graphic details of mutilations, speculating about the killer's identity, and turning the East End into a stage for middle-class readers' fears about urban poverty. The press coined the moniker Jack the Ripper from a letter sent to the Central News Agency, and the name stuck, transforming the unknown murderer into a figure of enduring infamy. For contemporaries, the Whitechapel murders symbolize the dangers lurking in the shadows of industrial modernity, overcrowded slums, lawless streets, unemployed men, and women forced to sell sex to survive. Yet the media frenzy also dehumanized the victims, who were often referred to simply as unfortunates, their names eclipsed by the myth of the killer. Public sympathy was mixed. While some reformers used the murders to highlight the plight of destitute women, others reinforced stereotypes, suggesting that prostitutes brought danger upon themselves. The police response revealed the limitations of Victorian law enforcement. Scotland Yard and the Metropolitan Police launched massive investigations, interviewing thousands and offering rewards, but their inability to catch the killer exposed both the practical difficulties of policing the labyrinthine alleys of Whitechapel and the deep mistrust between police and the poor. Many East End residents refused to cooperate, resenting police harassment of prostitutes while the killer roamed free. The murders fueled debates in Parliament about poverty, housing, and public order, with reformers pointing to the squalid conditions of Whitechapel as breeding grounds for vice and violence. Yet little concrete reform followed. The murders were consumed as spectacle more than catalysts for systemic change. The figure of Jack the Ripper became a cultural obsession, inspiring pamphlets, penny dreadfuls, and ballads, as well as endless speculation about his identity. Doctors, aristocrats, foreigners, and Jews all named as suspects in a swirl of rumor that revealed the prejudices of the age. Anti-Semitic riots erupted after graffiti near one crime scene was interpreted as blaming Jews, showing how quickly fear translated into scapegoating. Meanwhile, the women of Whitechapel continued their lives in the same conditions of poverty, fear, and vulnerability. The victims themselves, Nichols, Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, and Kelly, deserve attention beyond their deaths. Nichols, age 43, was the daughter of a blacksmith and had worked as a domestic servant before her marriage collapsed. She drifted between workhouses and the streets. Chapman, in her 40s, had lost several children to disease and lived in common lodging houses. Stride, a Swedish immigrant, supplemented her income from cleaning with prostitution. Eddowes, known for her humor and singing in the streets, had traveled widely but ended destitute. Kelly, the youngest of 25, had been described as pretty and was known to neighbors in Miller's Court, but she too lived on the edge of survival. These women were not anonymous symbols but individuals, each shaped by the brutal inequalities of Victorian society. Reformers such as Florence Fenwick Miller and members of the Women's Social and Political Union later pointed to the Ripper murders as evidence of the state's failure to protect poor women, linking them to broader demands for female suffrage and social reform. Yet in popular culture, the myth of the Ripper overshadowed the reality of the murdered poor. The killer became a figure of fascination, the subject of endless speculation, while the women were reduced to footnotes, their humanity erased by the very narratives that claimed to memorialize them. In the longer view, the Whitechapel murders crystallized the contradictions of Victorian responses to prostitution. Society was willing to consume the spectacle of murdered prostitutes, but unwilling to address the poverty, stigma, and lack of protection that made their lives precarious. The murders forced a brief reckoning with the dark realities of urban life, but the legacy that endured was a legend of Jack the Ripper, not the memory of Marion Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. To restore their voices is to remember that they were not simply victims of a murderer, but victims of society that placed them in harm's way long before his knife struck. Victorian prostitution was never confined to the dim gaslit alleys of Whitechapel or the music halls of London, for as Britain expanded its empire across the globe, it carried with it not only railways, armies, and commerce, but also the sex economies that shadowed imperial power, binding together colonies and metropole in a global network of vice, trafficking, and regulation that revealed both the dependence of empire on sexual exploitation and the hypocrisies of a nation that preached civilization abroad while tolerating exploitation within its own dominions. From the docks of Calcutta to the barracks of Hong Kong, from garrison towns in India to naval stations in the Mediterranean, prostitution followed the paths of empire, sustained by soldiers, sailors, and colonial officials whose presence created vast demand for sexual labor. British authorities, concerned above all with the health and efficiency of their troops, introduced systems of regulation similar to the Contagious Diseases Act, compelling local women suspected of prostitution to undergo medical examinations, detaining them in lock hospitals, and policing their movements. In India, the cantonment system established regulated brothels near military camps, euphemistically called chaklas, where women, often impoverished villagers or trafficked girls, were forced to serve soldiers under the watch of British medical officers. Official records reveal the cold pragmatism of policy. Prostitution was accepted as necessary for controlling male desire, but women's bodies were managed as potential vectors of venereal disease, examined weekly under conditions described by reformers as degrading and brutal. Similar systems appeared in Hong Kong, where colonial authorities licensed brothels and divided prostitutes by ethnicity, creating hierarchies of exploitation that reflected racial prejudices. Chinese women were often trafficked into the colony and placed in licensed houses, while European prostitutes, though fewer, were treated with relative leniency. In Singapore, Shanghai, and other treaty ports, British naval and trading communities relied on sex industries that drew women from across Asia, creating an international traffic in bodies that blurred the lines between voluntary migration and coercion. Reports of girls recruited under false pretenses of domestic work or marriage, only to be forced into brothels, circulated widely, feeding both reform campaigns and xenophobic anxieties in Britain. The empire thus became both consumer and conduit of trafficking, linking rural poverty in India, China, and Japan to the sexual demands of imperial cities. The rhetoric of civilization masked this reality. British officials portrayed regulation as a benevolent attempt to control disease and protect troops, framing indigenous prostitution as a social evil requiring management. Yet the system revealed the double standards of empire. While British men were free to indulge, local women bore the stigma and punishment of regulation. Reformers such as Josephine Butler condemned imperial prostitution as a form of slavery, extending her campaigns against the Contagious Diseases Acts to colonies. In speeches and pamphlets, she denounced the cantonment system in India as a market of women maintained by the state for the use of soldiers, insisting that such policies betrayed the ideals of Christian civilization Britain claimed to represent. The white slave panic of the 1880s also took on global dimensions, as reports circulated of British girls trafficked abroad to European and South American brothels. Parliamentary inquiries documented cases of women lured with promises of domestic service in Brussels or Buenos Aires, only to find themselves imprisoned in brothels, their passports confiscated. These revelations shocked the public, leading to international treaties in the 1890s aimed at suppressing trafficking, though enforcement remained weak and selective. The very term white slavery revealed the racialized nature concerned. The suffering of British women abroad provoked outrage, while the routine exploitation of colonized women in India or Hong Kong was largely ignored. The empire of vice was not only about prostitution as commerce, but also about the broader intersections of sexuality, power, and colonial domination. In some colonies, indigenous prostitution was framed by British authorities as evidence of moral inferiority, justifying imperial control. Yet at the same time, those same authorities relied on the existence of brothels to maintain military discipline. The contradictions were glaring, but they reflected the pragmatism of empire. Order and efficiency outweighed moral consistency. Cultural exchanges shaped the sex economy as well. In port cities, interracial liaisons between British men and local women produced mixed-race communities that often faced stigma from both sides. Missionaries decried these relationships as immoral, while reformers worried about the erosion of racial boundaries. The presence of prostitutes in colonial spaces thus intersected with wider anxieties about race, purity, and imperial authority. At the same time, stories of vice abroad filtered back into Britain, feeding the Victorian imagination of distant lands as both exotic and dangerous. Travel literature, missionary reports, and sensational journalism described Asian brothels, child trafficking, and opium dens, often blending moral outrage with Orientalist fascination. These accounts reinforce stereotypes of the immoral East while obscuring the active role of British officials and soldiers in sustaining exploitation. The global empire of vice thus reveals the interconnectedness of Victorian prostitution with broader systems of power, economy, and culture. It was not an isolated phenomenon of urban poverty, but part of the machinery of empire, sustained by migration, trafficking, and regulation. It highlights how the same structures of hypocrisy that govern prostitution at home, male privilege, female stigma, class, and racial double standards, were reproduced and magnified across the empire. Reform campaigns against trafficking and regulation achieved some successes, pressuring governments to sign international conventions and dismantle official brothel systems in India by the early 20th century. Yet the underlying dynamics of demand and exploitation persisted, reshaped but not eliminated by law. In the end, the empire of vice stands as one of the starkest contradictions of Victorian Britain, a nation that proclaimed itself the beacon of Christian morality while building a global system that commodified women's bodies for the service of men, a system that reached from the slums of London to the farthest outposts of empire, leaving behind a legacy of suffering, stigma, and silence that continues to shadow debates about sex work and trafficking to this day. By the closing years of the 19th century, the world of Victorian prostitution, once a tolerated as stigmatized presence in the great cities of Britain and its empire, entered a period of profound transition, shaped by shifting laws, changing urban landscapes, new forms of social activism, and the emergence of modern debates over sexuality, public health, and women's rights. And while the trade did not vanish, it adapted, declined in visibility, and assumed new forms that reflected the changing contours of Edwardian society. The repeal of the Contagious Diseases Act in 1886 marked a turning point, symbolizing the victory of Josephine Butler's long campaign and the rejection of state-sanctioned regulation, yet it also left unresolved the tensions between public health concerns, police powers, and women's rights. In the years that followed, police continued to harass prostitutes under vagrancy and soliciting laws, but without the formalized system of medical examination, prostitution retreated further into the shadows, less visible in regulated districts and more dispersed across lodging houses, street corners, and clandestine apartments. Urban redevelopment also reshaped the geography of vice. In London, the clearance of slums under new housing and sanitation schemes destroyed many of the narrow courts and alleys that had once sheltered brothels. The drive to modernize city centers created broader streets, new transport routes, and more visible policing, making prostitution less concentrated but not extinguished. The East End remained a hub of poverty and sex work, but the landscape of vice shifted with each round of redevelopment, forcing women to adapt to new urban environments. Meanwhile, the rising women's movement, galvanized by the successes of the repeal campaign, increasingly linked prostitution to broader demand for social and political rights. Activists argued that as long as women lacked economic opportunities, the sex trade would persist, and they pressed for reforms in wages, employment, and housing. The suffrage movement adopted prostitution as evidence of the state's disregard for women's safety, pointing to the hypocrisy of society that criminalized women for survival while denying them the vote. The debates of the 1890s and early 1900s thus framed prostitution not only as a moral medical issue but as a political one, tied to questions of citizenship and equality. The late Victorian panic over white slavery also continued to influence public discourse, leading to international agreements aimed at suppressing trafficking. The Brussels Conference of 1899 and subsequent conventions sought to create a cooperative framework for policing the cross-border trade in women. Britain signed on, reflecting its new role in an emerging global effort to regulate vice. Yet enforcement remained inconsistent, and moral rhetoric often outpaced practical change. At home, organizations like the National Vigilant Association and the Salvation Army continued their rescue work, but they also faced criticism for paternalism and moral policing, as their campaigns often targeted music halls, theaters, and dance venues that provided recreation for the working class. In cultural terms, the figure of the prostitute began to evolve as well. The trope of the tragic fallen woman persisted, but new literary and artistic currents complicated the image. The fin de siècle saw the rise of decadent literature and art, where prostitutes sometimes appeared not as passive victims, but as figures of danger, allure, or modernity. Writers such as George Bernard Shaw addressed prostitution directly in plays like Mrs. Warren's Profession, 1893, which depicted it as an economic system sustained by poverty and hypocrisy rather than personal sin. Though censored and controversial, Shaw's play represented a shift toward analyzing sex work in structural terms, foreshadowing 20th century debates. Public health discourse also shifted, increasingly influenced by medical science and the rise of bacteriology. Venereal disease remained a pressing concern, especially for the military, but new approaches emphasized education, prevention, and voluntary treatment rather than coercive inspection. Clinics were established in some cities, offering services to prostitutes and clients alike, though stigma continued to limit access. The growing recognition of syphilis as a national health crisis ensured that prostitution could not be ignored, even as reformers sought less punitive solutions. For the women themselves, survival remained the central challenge. Opportunities in factory work, service, and clerical employment expanded somewhat in the late Victorian and Edwardian years, but wages remained low, and many women continued to turn to sex work as supplement or last resort. Some found more discreet arrangements as mistresses or companions, supported by wealthier men, while others relied on informal networks of clients. The streetwalker remained a visible figure in poorer districts, but the profession increasingly fragmented. less dominated by large brothels and more characterized by dispersed, individual arrangements. The law's continuing emphasis on soliciting kept many women vulnerable to arrest, ensuring that stigma persisted. Decline, then, did not mean disappearance but transformation. Prostitution in Britain moved into a new phase, shaped by modern policing, medical science, urban redevelopment, and feminist critique. It remained a marker of inequality, a symbol of hypocrisy, and a survival strategy for thousands, but its cultural place shifted. By the time Queen Victoria died in 1901, the narrative of prostitution had changed from one of inevitable moral decline to one of social reform, political debate, and contested meaning. The Victorian prostitute was no longer only the fallen woman of melodrama or the tragic victim of reform tracts. She was also the subject of political activism, international treaties, medical studies, and even modernist literature. The survival of sex work into the 20th century revealed its resilience in the face of repression and reform alike, while its changing forms highlighted the adaptability of women navigating hostile systems. The transition from the late Victorian to the Edwardian period thus marks less an end than a transformation, the emergence of modern debates over sex work that would persist throughout the 20th century. In this sense, the decline of visible prostitution was less a victory of morality than a shift in visibility, as the structures of inequality that produced it remained in place, disguised by new laws, new rhetoric, and new urban landscapes. Though the 19th century ended and Victoria's reign passed into history, the shadows cast by the Victorian era's attitudes toward prostitution did not disappear, for the stigmas, hypocrisies, and contradictions forged in that period continue to shape debates about sex work, morality, and women's rights well into present day, reminding us that the so-called social evil was never simply a Victorian problem, but part of a longer continuum of how societies confront poverty, gender, and sexuality. The legacy of Victorian prostitution is visible first in persistence of stigma. The language of the fallen woman, though softened or modernized, echoes in the moral judgments directed at sex workers in the 20th and 21st centuries. Even as laws change, even as new vocabularies of public health, human rights, and trafficking emerge, the assumption that sex workers were somehow morally degraded or socially tainted remained embedded in culture, a direct inheritance from the Victorian obsession with respectability. This stigma continued to define the lives of women who sold sex, limiting their access to justice, healthcare, and political voice. The double standard of morality, too, endured. Victorian Britain excused men's participation while condemning women, and this imbalance, though challenged, persisted across generations. In the 20th century, debates about regulation versus abolition repeated many of the same arguments of the 1860s and 1880s, whether prostitution should be tolerated, criminalized, or reformed, whether women should be punished or rescued, and whether men should bear any responsibility. Laws against soliciting and brothel keeping continued to target women disproportionately, reflecting the old logic that female sexuality was dangerous while male desire was inevitable. In international terms, the Victorian panic over white slavery laid the foundation for modern anti-trafficking discourse. The treaties of the 1890s grew into the League of Nations conventions of the 1920s and, later, the United Nations efforts to suppress trafficking. Yet from the beginning, these frameworks often conflated consensual sex work with coerced trafficking, erasing the agency of women who chose prostitution under constrained circumstances and subjecting them to the same stigmatization as victims of coercion. The shadows of Victorian paternalism persisted in this tendency to speak about women rather than listen to them, to legislate on their behalf without including their voices. Reform organizations carried forward the legacy of the Salvation Army, the National Vigilance Association, and Josephine Butler's movement. Some evolved into modern charities offering support and rehabilitation. Others transformed into law enforcement partnerships focused on trafficking. In each case, the central tension remained between compassion and control, between support and surveillance. The structures of Victorian rescue homes, with their strict rules and demands for respectability, found echoes in 20th century rehabilitation centers that sought to reform sex workers by channeling them into domestic service or low-wage labor. While intentions varied, the underlying assumption that women needed saving from themselves remained familiar. In popular culture, the Victorian fallen woman trope lived on in new guises. Early 20th century cinema inherited the melodramatic arcs of 19th century theater, portraying prostitutes as tragic heroines or dangerous femme fatale. Later cultural works, from modernist novels to Hollywood films, continue to oscillate between pity and condemnation, fascination and repulsion. The myth of Jack the Ripper, born in 1888, grew into a global industry, spawning endless retellings in books, films, and television. In nearly every version, the mystery of the killer eclipsed the lives of the murdered women, repeating the Victorian erasure of their humanity. The endurance of the Ripper myth underscores the darker side of cultural memory, violence against sex workers consumed as entertainment, while their realities remained marginalized. Yet alongside these continuities, new movements challenged the Victorian inheritance. By the late 20th century, sex workers themselves began to organize, creating unions, advocacy groups, and campaigns for decriminalization. Their demands, to be recognized as workers with rights rather than victims or criminals, directly confronted the assumptions of the past. In Britain, groups such as the English Collective of Prostitutes echoed, in a new register, the protests of women detained under the Contagious Diseases Act, insisting that the real social evil was not prostitution itself but the poverty, inequality, and stigma that left women vulnerable. These modern voices represent an effort to reclaim the agency denied to their predecessors, to push back against the narratives established in the Victorian era. The debates that dominate contemporary politics about trafficking, decriminalization, public health, and women's autonomy are haunted by the Victorian legacy. The very language of rescue and vice carries echoes of 19th century reform. The tension between abolitionist feminists who view prostitution as inherently exploitative and sex worker rights activists who view it as labor mirrors a divide between Josephine Butler's condemnation and the unrecorded pragmatism of the women Henry Mayhew interviewed. Even today, public sympathy is often rationed along lines familiar to Victorians: compassion for young victims of trafficking, condemnation or indifference for older, poorer women surviving through sex work. In this sense, the shadow of the Victorian fallen woman still stretches across modern streets and policies. Yet history also offers lessons of resilience and resistance. The fragments of testimony preserved in diaries, courtrooms, and petitions remind us that Victorian prostitutes were not silent, that they contested the labels imposed upon them, that they asserted dignity in the face of stigma. Their voices, faint but enduring, challenge us to listen differently, to see continuity not only of oppression but of struggle. The Victorian age, with its contradictions of empire and morality, wealth and poverty, compassion and hypocrisy, remains a mirror in which modern societies can glimpse their own ambivalence about sex work. It shows how quickly outrage can be consumed as spectacle, how easily reform can become control, and how stubbornly stigma resists change. But it also shows that change is possible, that laws can be repealed, that women's voices can alter the course of politics, that even in the most hostile environments, survival is possible. The shadows that remain from the Victorian age are long and dark, but they are not unbroken. Within them lie the traces of resistance, solidarity, and courage that continue to inspire struggle for justice today. To remember the Victorian prostitute not only as victim or symbol, but as a woman navigating impossible choices is to honor her humanity and to recognize the unfinished work of confronting inequality in our own time. The story of Victorian prostitution is not simply a chapter in the past. It is part of a larger history of how societies confront the intersection of poverty, gender, sexuality, and power, a history still being written in the shadows of our modern cities.